Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining this International Policy Engagement Training for Polar Early Career Scientists, hosted by the Polar Science Early Career Community Office, or PSECCO, and the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, or ICCI. You'll be hearing a lot more from ICCI folks here shortly, but we're going to kick off the event with some introduction items. Hello, I'm Mariama Dryak Valleys. I'm the director for PSECCO, and I'm joined by Madison Payne, who is our PSECCO events coordinator. She's been emailing you all, and she'll be acting as technical support for the event today. And so if you have any challenges along the way or running into any bumps, please direct message Madison. We're also joined by, as I noted, two ICCI speakers, Dr. Susanna Hancock and Dr. James Kirkham. I'll give a very short intro to them, and then you'll be hearing a lot more from them here soon. Before we get started, though, I want to note that at the core of PSECCO is building welcoming environments for everyone, and we expect all attendees to adhere to PSECCO's community guidelines when interfacing with others on the call, be that in the chat, or maybe later when asking a question. If you're not familiar with those guidelines, Madison has just pasted a link to those in the chat, but high level, you can see summarized on the screen. Many of us here do polar science in location across the United States and beyond, with research focused on both poles and in high alpine regions across the world. And we want to acknowledge that much of that science takes place on the unceded traditional territories and ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples, and that some research done in these locations has historical roots in colonialism. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples to our understanding of the polar regions, and we want to recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have and continue to develop in relationship to their lands. On the call today, we've just done our welcome and we've shared these community guidelines. As I noted, I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll hear a lot more from Susanna and James on how you all can engage in the international policy space and more. They have a lot of wonderful things to share with you today. And then hopefully, if we have some more time, we'll have an opportunity to hear some answers to questions from the audience. And so if you have questions throughout the call, please pop those in the chat and we'll be tracking them throughout the call. And then if there is that time, James and Susanna can speak to them. But we won't be pausing the presentation mid-presentation for question answering. And then we'll have a quick wrap up and outro. So now let's hear about who we'll be hearing from today. The International Cryosphere Climate Initiative is a network of senior policy experts and researchers working with governments and organizations to create, shape, and implement initiatives designed to preserve as much of the Earth's cryosphere as possible. They do really important work, and two of the people who are a part of that are joining us today. Dr. Susanna Hancock, as I noted, she's now the Global Mountains Director at ICCI and focuses on advancing science-informed policy across global governance and United Nations-linked processes. And we also are joined by Dr. James Kirkham, the Chief Science Advisor and Coordinator of the Ambition on Melting Ice High-Level Group, and supports science-informed action on sea level rise and mountain water resources within the international policy space. So with that, I think we're going to pass it over to hear a lot more from them. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Excellent. Well, I will just start off by saying thank you very, very much to PSECCO for having James and me here today, and for this opportunity to talk to you about something that is for us very exciting and important. This talk, as the slide says, is about cryosphere and climate science diplomacy. So we're going to talk you through several things. One, I can advance the slide. All right, sorry, what it is and how you can effectively communicate with policymakers, and why we need to convince policymakers to care about ice, and especially at this critical juncture for climate action. All right. So I will be speaking about this from our perspective as the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, or ICCI, an NGO that tries to bridge the gap between cryosphere science and the policy sector, primarily within the UN negotiation space. Our organization is composed of a mixture of climate scientists and former climate negotiators and diplomats, and we use this space to lobby for greater ambition regarding country emission reductions. So just a, I'm advancing, sorry, I'm not sure this advancing is working very well. James, I might pass it back to you because that's feeling a bit
Sure, I can advance the
personal.
slides.
All right. So we'll just do a quick introduction to the two of us. So I'm Susanna. As Mariama said, I'm the Global Mountains Director with ICCI. I fell in love from a very young age with the ice through my background passions in astrophysics that started when I was 4 years old. I grew up between Maine here in the United States and also in northern Norway, which had a huge influence in my understanding of the polar regions, the Arctic specifically, on day-to-day influences in life and the climate impacts of the Arctic. Started off my first field work I did with the British Antarctic Survey and glaciology about Nýjukr in Iceland, and did graduate school in England, which was a mixture of Arctic research, and then got into diplomacy. Spent a little bit of time in the ECR space as president of APEX and have played around in the diplomacy climate action sphere in the Arctic until joining ICCI about 2 years ago. And yes, thank you, Mariama, ECR, ECS, early career researcher and scientist. So James, if you want to say a moment about you.
Yeah, super. Thanks so much. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So as Mariana said, my name is James Kirkham. I'm a British glaciologist who did his PhD at the British Antarctic Survey. But for a very long time, I've been generally interested in the intersection between how science gets into policy. And so I've done various roles in intergovernmental organizations and through to the UK government. And about 3 years ago, an opportunity came along to get involved with ICCI through COP27, which was held in Egypt at the time. And after this, I've been trying to put my skills to bear, bringing in the science and trying to bring the relevance of the rapid changes we're seeing across the world through to these UN negotiations. And we'll talk to you a bit more about that in a second. So back to you, Susanna. I can advance the slide.
Thank you.
Whenever you want.
All right. So if you can advance. Can you advance the slide? Ah,
I think James's connection's a bit rough. Madison, do you have those slides downloaded still?
I don't have control to advance anymore.
Yes. Madison, can you pull up the slides that you downloaded as a backup?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Susanna, Madison has them.
Yeah.
You might,
Yeah.
if we've lost James, you might have to take it away.
No, that's perfect.
Okay. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. So we're looking for slide number 4, I believe. So I could say that when we talk about the cryosphere, we're really talking about 5 different dynamics. Yeah, it's well before that. Yeah, that slide. Perfect. Thank you.
Beautiful.
And the cryosphere is one of the most sensitive parts of the planet and Earth's system, and its loss has clear policy implications for billions of people around the world. So this is just a selection of policy relevant impacts that we look at that are here on the slide. So we're looking at rising seas, changing water supplies, increased hazards, reductions in our remaining carbon budget through permafrost thaw, changes to agriculture and fisheries, for example. Okay, you can advance, please. Thank you. Traditionally, cryosphere issues have been largely seen as region-specific, early warning systems of climate change within policy circles. But now we're really beginning to see greater appreciation for the largely irreversible impacts that cryosphere loss has on the entire world. Science continues to reiterate the inevitable conclusion that only urgent action through emissions reductions alongside efforts to avoid overshoot can avoid multi-century global impacts that have the potential to exceed the loss of the capacity for adaptation in many areas. Would you like to advance? Next slide. Thank you. So this is just a list of key fora where policy discussions occur throughout the cryosphere. So key bodies that we will focus on here, really the UNFCCC, so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we have the Paris Agreement, also the IPCC, Arctic Circle, the Antarctic Treaty System, which has its meetings next week, some of the different mountainous regions, the glaciers, and the global cryosphere. So key meetings, again, we're going to talk a lot about the COP process, SBs being the spring half, the other half of the negotiations. And some key reports, so the IPCC, the SROC, the Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere, the sixth assessment report and the seventh assessment report that's forthcoming, AMAP, SCAR, so we've got Arctic, Antarctic, and then our own State of the Cryosphere reports that I'll talk about in a moment, and key participants from various areas. So I'm going to go next slide and pass it back to James if you're around.
Yep, let's try that. Apologies for the bandwidth issues. So let's try again. This talk is going to be a lot about these three letters. So, and when I give this talk a lot in person, I normally start by asking for a show of hands about who's actually been to a COP. We don't have to do this here, but what this normally shows is essentially that very few scientists have been to a COP. And I then go on to ask them, okay, how many have you actually followed the negotiations? And even fewer hands get held up in the air. So really, this exercise shows that many scientists have not been to a COP, and the very thought of this annual meeting conjures up images of people in suits talking about very technical agreements, world leaders making grand speeches, protesters saying they're not doing enough, and of course, lots and lots of private jets and planes. But at the heart of this meeting, it's the place where countries come together to negotiate how to deal with dangerous human-caused climate change. So really, regardless of what you think of this forum, it's the forum we have. And so it's really important to engage with it if we want our particular voice to be heard. Now, for a bit of history here, COPs have been going on for over 3 decades now, starting back in 1992, when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was first designed. 5 years later, the Kyoto Protocol was signed, that gave developed countries targets to reduce their emissions for the first time ever. Then in Copenhagen in 2009, a deal was made to globally accept the need to limit warming to below 2 degrees, but a much more ambitious deal collapsed at the last minute, leading to generally negative perceptions of this COP, which still linger on today. Now, it took 21 COPs to get the Paris Agreement, which for the first time ever says that all countries will have climate targets to keep the world well below 2 degrees, with the aim of keeping warming below 1.5. Now, the Paris Agreement is so significant because it operates something called the ratchet mechanism, which is where each country has to
We lost James again. Okay. So the ratchet mechanism here, I can just,
progress.
Oh, you rock. Back, James.
Just waiting for the slide to change. And getting Susanna or not?
James, can you turn off your video and we can see if that helps with connection? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, apologies for the bandit. Let's try this. So the first global stock take was conducted 2 years ago at COP28 in Dubai. And for the first time ever, and this is COP28, the need to transition away from fossil fuels was stated explicitly in the outcome. Now, that was certainly historic, but whether that's in a positive or a negative sense is a bit down to your opinion. Now, there are many ways to participate in a COP, and numbers have ballooned in recent years. So traditionally, about 5 to 10,000 people attended COPs every year. But a new record was broken at COP28 when over 80,000 people attended in Dubai. And we've seen numbers over 50,000 in the last 2 years. So there are different types of badges, which you can see on the right side of the screen here. And the increase in recent years is mostly caused by what we call overflow badges, which is basically people countries bring along, might be businesses or other people like this, but also observers, which are typically what scientists fall into, have also grown a bit too. And of course, the elephant in the room here is that in Dubai, we had over 2,000 fossil fuel lobbyists attend, either to make business deals on the side or keep an eye on the negotiations. So how does it work? Well, a large part of the work is, of course, an ongoing process. And so a lot of the preparation for the COPs actually happens in Bonn in June, so in Germany, where I'm based, with these working level meetings with country negotiators. And these meetings lay the groundwork for a number of different negotiating texts, which are then negotiated throughout the COP later in the year. And so this might cover mitigation, so basically how can we reduce our emissions, adaptation, and loss and damage. So how do we compensate countries for damage financially that we can't adapt to? Then come November, December, we have tens of thousands of delegates converging on a place like this to meet for about 2 weeks at a COP. And the slide you just saw was the Baku Stadium from COP29. And so there's different areas of that space set aside for negotiations, side events, announcements, journalists, and public plenary space. The first 2 days of the COP typically start with a leaders' summit, where we have many grand speeches, and a couple of them can be incredibly passionate. So one of the ones that caught my eye from COP29 was this emotional message from Simon Steele, the UNFCCC's executive secretary. Now, he's from Grenada, which just a few months earlier had been utterly devastated by Hurricane Beryl, the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record. And Madison, could you play this video for me, please?
Oh, we don't have audio.
Okay, no worries. Then we'll skip ahead past the video slides then, please. So what that was going to show is that you have very passionate people affected by climate change, in this case, someone who in a very high-level position, but who had lost a lot of his community and homes from a hurricane, followed by the president of Azerbaijan, who is this guy, who used his speech instead to basically attack the media and double down on the spoil is a gift from God comment. So it really shows the diverse political landscape that we have to deal with at these conferences. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Madison. So whilst these big speeches are happening, the country negotiators are starting the really difficult task of conducting the negotiations. And you typically meet in these big square rooms with screens to view the text and microphones. And at the back, you can see a series of chairs where observers can watch what's happening.
James, can you repeat that last sentence? Or it might be back to you, Susanna.
Might be back to me. That's fine. But basically, we meet in these big square rooms, often without windows, with screens and microphones. Are you back, James? And observers in the back so that they can be able to see what is happening and follow along. So we can advance the slide. Thank you. So countries don't necessarily negotiate as individual countries, but rather in large blocks or groupings to give them more weight. This is an extremely complex process, as countries can also be parts of multiple blocks, as you can see here on this slide. And sometimes they use this to strengthen negotiating positions or points. You can advance, please. Statements are made by what we call raising a flag. So it's the country placard with the name. And they get weight, and then they wait to be called on by the chair of the meeting. Countries can give comments to the chairs about the texts that are being discussed. The chairs then have the responsibility to collate these comments and redraft the text in what they can see as a balanced way. Next slide. If countries can't agree about a particular point or a path forward, they often leave the formal setting of the square tables and form what we call a huddle and find a particular workaround for some sticking point in the language. So this reminds us, perhaps, if you can advance the next slide, of our friends from the southern continent. Advance slide, please. Thank you. Elsewhere in COPs, there's a pavilion space where both countries and civil society can have pavilions. And to many, it feels very much like a surreal trade show and has also contributed to a COP with that idea that it is more of a trade show than discussions, but that's definitely a separate side of it. Some use these pavilions to show off their country, highlight what their country may be doing to address climate change. Others use it as ways to provide relevant information to the COP, to the negotiators as well, although there's often a pretty big distinction in who is where. Often get high-level visitors. So we've got Kyrgyzstan there on mountain development, and then the other three are Cryosphere pavilions. All right. Towards the middle of the second week of COP, so they're 2-week long events, ministers show up and resolve some of the sticking points that were unable to be resolved in the first week. This occurs through high-level bilateral meetings or sessions with larger groups. And then if we're lucky, we have a decision. Decisions at COPs are made by consensus, which means that each country has the power to veto overall, which makes it very hard to get anything through, but then what is through has near universal, if not universal support. Consensus, though, is generally taken to mean that there are no stated objections to the proposed decision. So really, unless a country formally objects to the deal in the closing plenary, that it is accepted. Over the years, countless decisions have been abandoned. They've been watered down and deferred to the next negotiation space because of a very small number of objections. So, big question, is it working? You know, things are definitely still getting worse. However, we are no longer heading towards this 4-degree of warming by 2100, which is a considerable achievement from where we were recently. That being said, we are still a very long way from where we need to be. We remain far off track. The Paris Agreement is working. Its projected policies are bending the curve, sort of the current policy lines of where we'd be going forward, but we're heading towards maybe 2.6, 2.7 degrees by 2100, which is still well above that 1.5 or even the 2 degrees that we had promised. So this was the backdrop at which countries gathered to Brazil last year. So just showing where these current trends are going. So you can see that we are bending that curve, but we're still not where we need to be. All right. So how do we conduct climate science diplomacy in this environment? I mentioned earlier, we have our State of the Cryosphere reports. So on our more academic side, we publish these peer-reviewed annual reports, which is written in negotiator or policy-friendly language. So this is something that takes our science that we want to communicate in ways that are relevant and understandable for the general policymaker. And this provides a base of information for them to understand and hopefully bring into their negotiations as to why this is important. We also work closely with networks of journalists to raise awareness of these issues and policy relevance of the cryosphere, particularly at and around key events such as COP. At COPs, again, we run the Cryosphere Pavilion, which is now a well-recognized space dedicated to raising what's at stake in the negotiations from a cryosphere perspective. We tend to run around 60 events on average in this space where the latest cryosphere science is presented and throughout the course of the COP over the 2 weeks, running in parallel to the negotiations. We also run campaigns such as this one, which we launched ahead of COP28 in Dubai in 2023, to highlight the consensus within the cryosphere community that 2 degrees really is too high to prevent the global impacts from the loss of the cryosphere at that temperature. This was signed by more than 1,000 cryosphere scientists, including many IPCC authors, and it really acted as a lever that we were able to deploy to counter the pushback against highlighting the importance of 1.5 degrees that was experienced in the closing stages of COP28 that year. But the bulk of our work is actually done at the country level with the country level negotiators who are responsible for drafting and negotiating these key texts of these climate agreements. And as well at the very highest level of the ministers and heads of state of government. So one of the ways that we do this is through a group called the Ambition on Melting Ice, high-level group for sea level rise and mountain water resources. We'll call it AMI for short. And the idea here, and we as ICCI serve as the secretariat for this group. The idea here is that countries are not just those that contain ice, but it's open to all and especially encourages membership from countries that are actually affected by the loss of ice. So either changes through downstream water resources, sea level rise, etc. We are now 25 countries and we work strong. We work with about 15 others, and it's including a good representation of the various negotiating groups. So our meetings are very fruitful in terms of outcomes that touch upon a variety of the UN CCC negotiations and the needed climate action. I believe we now have representation from all negotiating blocs apart from the pro-fossil fuel ones. So AMI is a high-level group, as a high-level group, has a declaration that stresses the importance of averting impacts from the cryosphere loss for the whole world. Again, not just those places that contain ice. The idea is to raise ambition of mitigation efforts by raising the collective concern of many nations about these issues. We have strategy meetings with AMI twice a year where we bring negotiators and cryosphere scientists together to discuss the latest science and how these scientific findings can feed into negotiation strategy. These meetings sometimes include field trips for negotiators so that they can establish personal connections and memories with some of these areas. And the AMI negotiators often request tailored talking points linking the cryosphere science to different negotiation tracks throughout the negotiations, both at COPs and the Bonn meetings. So here are a couple examples of the language that we use in negotiations. This is from Bonn last year, linking the loss of cryosphere to irreversibility, the global impacts, and the need to deliver deep and rapid and sustained reductions in emissions. So, how do you communicate with policymakers effectively? So just wanting to share a couple quick lessons that we've learned personally throughout this. Knowing your audience. It's not enough to say that, yes, ice is melting in Greenland, because many of these people haven't been there. And for them, that seems like it's a place that's very, very far away. They think of these places as remote, out of sight, out of mind. So in order to make it relevant to this audience, or to any audience really, being able to understand what the impacts are that Greenland will have on their country, on their daily lives. And that's what we try to communicate. So our aim is to do this to align our message with existing values, to make it local to them. So framing climate change as a matter of health, economics, or national security can, for example, appeal to people who may not be otherwise as engaged with environmental concerns, but care deeply about these other issues. using good graphics. So remembering that policymakers are not scientists. They don't necessarily know how to read complex graphics. Animations such as this can be powerful and also provide a concise message when you have little time to explain to them. And feeling not necessarily pressured to use complex graphs. These are some excellent summary figures from 2 Science and Nature papers that were published last year. They're a classic example. Scientifically, they're brilliant figures. They show so much information contained within them, but they're completely overwhelming and incomprehensible to most policy makers. And so people get lost in this, and it doesn't have the impact for them that one hopes. So in many cases, for example, for this, it's best to present findings as numbers and tables, especially if you can animate to focus on the information that you would really like to show. So actually, we brought the lead author of this paper to Bonn last year to present at a research dialogue. And we can tell you that the number of photos that were taken of slides just like this were the most that were taken throughout the presentation. It's just gets the information pretty quickly. So it may seem obvious, but you'd be surprised by the number of times that we've had scientists come to address policymakers, such as they would be addressed if they were to go to the EGU, for example, or the AGU. Unfortunately for us, if we don't dress appropriately, policymakers obviously often don't take us as seriously. So this is something that's really important for us when we're coming into sort of their space. Indeed, and we in civil society often even outdress policymakers, really, because that's important for us to get our message across. And a final tip is to end a message with hope, something that empowers people and gives them something that they can go on. Often when we speak about climate change and the outlook for a cryosphere, we end up with people saying that that's something that's really depressing, and but what can I do about it? So this is something that studies consistently show as well. The majority of people are concerned about climate change, but most don't know how to make a difference at an individual level. So hope inspires people. It inspires people more than fear. And it's therefore important that when we speak, to connect to the heart and to the head, to connect the head to the heart and the heart to the hands, so that people can link that knowledge and emotional concerns with concrete actions, so that they can feel that they can make a difference. For policymakers, this may be in relation to a particular design, a decision, a vote, or regulation. General public, for voting for local actions, talking with friends and neighbors, sustainable transportation habits, reducing waste. For the private sector, maybe it's about where to invest or divestments that can be made. We can't afford these missed opportunities. And every time you write an article, speak to the media, engage with the varied audiences, we need to figure out how to engage that call to action that empowers people. Timescales are also very difficult to pitch in our field. Many of the largest numbers are decisions that are going to be made centuries away, affect decisions made centuries away from the farthest election timescales, far from the election timescales that we often think about in policymaking. So using emotion and stories to connect people and to affect change. This graphic, I think, is brilliant because it shows that a child born today will live well beyond 2100. But if you have, a young child or a niece or a nephew, talk about them, for example, establish that emotional connection, that responsibility of the choices that we make today in our world will be their future. Pointing out the cost of inaction that will vastly outweigh the cost of acting now is another way of approaching this. Dealing with uncertainty is another huge challenge, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with talking about uncertainties when talking to policymakers. In fact, it is simply a matter of being credible and a responsible scientist. However, dealing with uncertainty can be challenging because it's often seen as ignorance. Framing uncertainties as unknowns and potential risks is one way to address this. And it's also important not to conclude with what we don't know. Trying to end with a consistent and clear message is important. So another emerging challenge that we've had that has really shown up in the past 12 or 18 months has been a pushback on science. This is an example of text from the Research and Systematic Observation negotiation track at Bonn last year. It's usually one of the least contentious negotiation tracks, but here this pushback played out in the negotiation of the text, multiple specific examples of science and urgency being cut from the original text over the course of the 2 weeks. So here we can see on the left, noted with alarm and utmost concern, and that was changed to just noted the information. Specific examples of climate extremes, including record glacier loss, being vaguely referred to as slow onset and extreme events, and every increment of warning changing just to global warming. And the hardest fought of all was actually that narrative on 1.5 degrees centigrade, with a statement about current temperatures eventually being relegated to a footnote there. So many countries complained about the pushback on science, but what to do about this still is an open question. So what actually happened at COP30? 2025 was a critical year because it was around the deadline for the next round of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions within the COP process that were due at COP30 last November. And these NDCs set the course of emissions for 2030 to 2035 and should also update existing policy targets, again, going forward for the next 5 years, leading towards that. So around 550,000 delegates got together in Belém, Brazil, and have now experienced what life on the equator is like under the current climate emissions. It's a life in a world where days are hit with 30 degrees centigrade, humidity hits 80%, torrential downpours wash away livelihoods and flood roads, and infrastructure ends up being jammed and leading to polluted cities. Brazil brought climate negotiators to the climate frontline for many people. This conference started off with President Lula calling for national roadmaps to end deforestation and to transition off of fossil fuels. The plan was to achieve what we call a global mutrao, which is a self-organized effort to support one another in times of need. Conditions were challenging to say the least. Indoor rain, Pacific Islands pavilion actually flooded, so a bit of irony there with them having to close because of the water damage. And of course, there was a fire that many of you may have heard about. I don't know whether this slide, I'm not sure that's gonna work, but oh. Okay, so there should be imagery here. The fire broke out. Okay. Anyway, fire broke out in the middle one day, and but open protests returned to COP last year. This was a great thing after 3 years of being in an autocratic government where protests were heavily restricted. And early on in the conference, a large group of indigenous protesters blocked the entrance and demanded to speak with President Lula about the destruction of forest and rivers by industry. This COP was notable because they were referring to it as the COP of the Amazon, really wanting to connect with the Amazon community and ecosphere. So being able to, this was very much part of this conversation. President Lula wasn't there, so instead they got the COP30 president, Correa de Lago, who led them away and had 3 hours of apparently quite productive conversations from what we heard. Progress was made in terms of agreeing to a just transition mechanism, policies that support the protection of workers and communities as countries shift to clean energy and a more climate resilient future. There was a 2-year plan on climate finance that was established, as well as a commitment to triple adaptation cash by 2035, which was delivered and long overdue. Many climate vulnerable nations are losing as much as 10% of their GDP every year to climate impacts, for example. Another first at COP this year was the first ever reference to the word overshoot, an acknowledgement that it's now impossible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade without at least some period of temporarily exceeding that warming. So this doesn't mean that the 1.5 target is dead at all, but rather that it will have to be approached from above rather than from below, preferably after as short and as low of an overshoot as possible. Under, again, the research and systematic observation track, parties couldn't agree to recognize the IPCC as the best available science. Several countries in the closing plenary lamented to this fact. So this is again showing with the text from Bonn last year. So this again continued into COP25. Sorry, COP30 in 2025. Strong references to cryosphere loss were relegated to a footnote at the end, although this is even a very significant improvement compared with just the year before in COP29. So a few of us as cryosphere scientists also who were witnessing this in Belém later wrote a conversation piece. So James was an author of this piece about the mistreatment of cryosphere science within this process. So you can look up this in the conversation if you would like more details. And on the final day, the closing plenary became quite marred with drama when a decision about mitigating emissions was gavelled through whilst objections were still being raised, especially by Colombia, over the fact that fossil fuels were not specifically referenced in the outcome. This led to a last-minute scramble in the closing plenary. Decisions proceeded, but challenges have come out as a result of this. Ultimately, no roadmaps were achieved within the COP process, but the Brazilian presidency did launch 2 roadmaps outside of the UNFCCC process, which were backed by 90 countries. We're still waiting on these, but there is some continued work in this direction. Belém saw signs that those talks also may accelerate in other venues, which we've started to see. So indeed, very shortly after COP, the COP president put out a letter reflecting on the climate diplomacy limitations that played out in Belém and suggesting further that a new 2-speed system is needed, whereby new coalitions of willing actors can lead to fast, practical action alongside the slower consensus-based decision-making within the UNFCCC process. So achievements for the cryosphere at COP30 were perhaps a little more heartening. For the 6th year, we hosted the Cryosphere Pavilion. This year, we did it along with the nations of Chile and Iceland. Where we elevated the importance of the latest scientific developments around the cryosphere to policymakers. Over 2 weeks, we hosted 40 cryosphere-specific events with speakers ranging from the Arctic, polar and mountain researchers, indigenous peoples, youth, climate negotiators, and policy experts, all of whom brought the urgency of mitigation of fossil fuel emissions to the forefront with references on the global impacts associated with continued cryosphere loss. We also had our annual ICCI ECS program, so bringing early career researchers and scientists to COPs. We brought 8 again this year to share their research and voice with the policymakers. We will be putting out a call again for COP31 this year, so that will probably come out around August, but you can be in touch with us if that appeals to you. Half of our early career researchers this year were from South America, did an incredible job and a real tribute to our community as early career researchers and cryosphere scientists. They got pretty strong exposure, and a couple highlights here, just sharing their science to climate minister from Fiji, and one of our early career scientists also read the closing statement for the Research and Independent NGO group during the closing plenary. And after the experience in the research negotiation talk I spoke about earlier, we also conducted an official side event highlighting the perils of ignoring science. So this event summarized the latest projections for glacier loss, the importance of acknowledged co-production with indigenous peoples, and the persistent gap between scientific evidence and political action. And as well, in its capacity as the secretariat for this AMI high-level group, we coordinated a ministerial meeting in November. And this was opened and presided over Iceland's Minister of the Environment, with the COP29 president also opening the meeting. And we had high-level statements from all of these countries that are on the screen right here, talking about the importance of staying below 1.5. So we've seen some successes over the recent years. In COP26, for example, 2021 in Glasgow, first time cryosphere was ever mentioned in the cover decision. We built on this in COP27, where Cryosphere went into the operational language. COP28 was really difficult in Dubai. Cryosphere wasn't mentioned specifically, but AMI countries used Cryosphere certainly to stress the importance of that 1.5 over 2 degrees and really helped holding the line for 1.5. And COP29 was similar in difficulty, especially it was a big year for finance. And this past year at COP, seeing the opportunities to bring in cryosphere science for the support of NDCs, for example, and related to tipping points and thresholds for the coral reefs and the rainforests and things that are more specific to the Amazon region. So quickly, just opportunities for COP31. It's going to have an unprecedented system of leadership this year. Turkey hosting and Australia running the negotiations. Hopefully this will be a positive where Australia can really focus on the negotiations and an outcome rather than having to deal with some of the logistics. So hopefully this is an opportunity to inject urgency, science, and fresh air into what has become somewhat of a stagnant negotiation space. So faced with the grim outlook of overshooting 1.5, countries, especially the advanced economies, really need to own this situation and move from treating net zero emissions as an endpoint to their climate policy rather to more being just a milestone towards what we really can eventually have as net negative emissions. Sorry, not net negative. So if this action is taken urgently, it is still very much possible to bring temperatures as low as 1.2 degrees by the end of the century, and with 1 degree centigrade long term, which really is where we're getting into the true safe limit for the cryosphere. Achieving this, however, will require us to phase out coal by 2040s, gas 2050s, and oil 2060s, as well as cutting emissions and maybe needing to scale up some land-based carbon dioxide removal. We are also working along with the UN Environment Programme on a report outlining the implications for overshooting 1.5 on the cryosphere. So this will be published before the next COP, and we're currently recruiting authors for this. The IPCC recently met in Bangkok, where there was a huge debate over the timelines for the next 7th assessment report, with some seeking to delay to reduce the urgency. The outcome for this was pretty disappointing, and it's setting up quite a battle for the next IPCC meeting. But it's incredibly important that countries push for timelines that allow the 7th assessment report to be published in time to inform the next global stocktake for 2028, as this really needs to be informed by the latest, best available science. Another avenue that Australia, where they can injecting science and leadership, is what's known as the review of the long-term temperature goal. This is what science says is a long-term safe temperature for the Earth. This is where that 2 degrees came from, as well as those efforts to pursue 1.5 in the Paris Agreement. Australia leading on this and giving some recent scientific developments in the sensitivity in Antarctica and other cryosphere areas in recent years, particularly with the new results that extends timeframes looking centuries into the future rather than just stopping at 2100. It seems like this could be a key area where negotiations can really be informed by and follow the science. So the COP30 presidency had already noted there was a need to accelerate climate action outside of the UNFCCC through other coalitions of the willing. And one of these was the first conference dedicated to transitioning away from fossil fuels. 57 countries were there, including Australia. So hopefully this can feed into discussions in COP31, despite the fact that it's going to remain, at least for the time being, a complementary and parallel process. The importance of this conference in Santa Marta, Colombia, has been made even more obvious in recent weeks, given the chaos in the oil markets following the situation in Iran. And the case for national security really has never been stronger. National security for energy. How many of us are not fed up with having national energy prices being dictated by some of these conflicts? So the importance of this also showed that there are luckily there are immensely optimistic signs that this transition towards a green energy is alive and is accelerating. So we can see here that, if I can advance the slide, that global renewables have actually overtaken coal as the largest source of power in 2025. And specifically, the growth of renewables in China and India is especially significant because these are responsible for some of the largest growths in emissions in the past decade. So you can see here that renewables are beginning to squeeze out coal in these countries as well. And the price of solar, wind, and batteries continues to plummet and has done so in the past decade. So these numbers speak for themselves. This transition is happening, but we still need political will and leadership to accelerate it faster and further. So, Cryosphere policy opportunities in this year, in 2026. Looking ahead for this year, some good opportunities for us to engage with policymakers. Just going over a couple, some of these have already happened, but in March, there was a 2-day event at UNESCO headquarters in Paris that celebrated the World Day for Glaciers. This marked the end of last year's International Year for Glaciers Preservation and served as the technical launch for the Decade of Action on Cryospheric Sciences. So the aim here in this event was to ensure that the momentum built in the last IYGP continues forward as a global effort into the next decade. Over the past week, Colombia hosted the first conference on the transitioning away from fossil fuels. So this initiative, as just mentioned, aims to complement the UNFCCC process to create a roadmap for ending fossil fuels and offer steps for a just and equitable transition. AMI has been involved in some of the work here and put out statements and supporting the discussions on the need for urgency and limiting overshoot for the cryosphere. Next week, we have the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings that are going to be held in Hiroshima. June, we'll have the SB 64, the intersessional Paris Agreement part of the COP process negotiations, as well as the second Mountain Dialogue in Germany, Climate Week, COP 31 in Turkey. And, so we've learned a lot of lessons and continue to face some challenges here that are experienced throughout this journey. Clarity of message is key, focusing on how the issue affects people with whom you're speaking. What are the things they care about? Personal connections to those who are involved in the process, absolutely vital. Finding local champions to raise these issues within the process. Providing a message of hope, concrete steps that people can take to make a difference. This is often much more inspiring and powerful than messages of fear, and that a sustained effort really does pay off. So in terms of challenges, keeping the attention of those in the highest positions are difficult when they have a wide portfolio of topics they must cover. Turnover in staff and administrations often means that we feel like we're re-educating and reinventing the wheel. The world is messier than ever. It's a messy place. So keeping the attention on climate in a crowded space is quite difficult. And lastly, communicating the new emerging science so that we're still at that cutting edge, such as the changes in Antarctic sea ice in recent years, as well. Yes. So this keeping on top of the latest science is challenging, but especially when you're trying to maintain trust and integrity. So final thoughts. Just, thank you very much for having us. Sorry about the tech issues, but thank you all for all the work that you're doing. The research and the science, and whether that science is very broadly, so whatever that subject is for you, has the potential to really inform policymakers throughout the climate sphere and to shape our future. So thank you for doing that. We live in a very difficult world right now. And I know, truly know this, that there's a gap between what we're saying as understanders of the climate sphere and the urgency that brings with the pace of acting in the policy sphere is a bitter pill to swallow, very challenging. But we're here in a critical moment where we can really make a difference if we pull together and fight harder than ever. For the cryosphere, every 1/10 of a degree really matters. So every fraction of warming that can be avoided, it saves ice, it lessens the impacts, and it makes adaptation possible for hundreds of millions of people. And we really need to fight for every 1/10 of a degree. So thank you again. And this just says James's email, but I'm Susanna at ICCI.org. So I will leave it there, and thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. Thanks so much. I think we have time for one question, and or maybe I'll do 1.5 questions and combine them. There were a couple good ones in the chat, and namely, in what ways can early career researchers meaningfully contribute to these organizations or conversations? And then with that, there was a call out to the New York NYC Climate Week. Do either you or James have any thoughts on that?
Well, oh, thanks, James. Yeah, I can just start by saying that mentioned earlier, and James, you can correct me on the timeline for this. We will be putting out a call, or expect to be putting out a call for ECSs to join us in Turkey, where we try to bring researchers or scientists from different cryosphere related fields to joining us to talk to policymakers, to present their science, to share what's important to them, and help make some of these connections, so that also people who are going to be making decisions in the world in the future are being able to assert themselves in it now as well. So call for that will probably be in August, end of the summer. Certainly can follow. So we have some social media you can follow on Blue Sky and LinkedIn, but also can reach out to either of us.
Absolutely. Hopefully you can hear me. Apologies for whatever was going on back then. But if you go to our website, there's a sign up to a weekly email list, which you can click on, and that will give you awareness whenever we release the calls. So not just for the COP, but sometimes we also bring ECS to regional conferences too. So last year we brought a load to Tajikistan for a glaciers conference there. And so if you sign up for those, we'll be the first to know whenever we release the call for that. Susanna says it's likely to be sometime in the sort of late summer.
Climate Week is a little more complicated. There's a lot of different players there. And we tend to be more on the ministerial side there and working specifically with countries, not engaging as much with ECSs, but that tends to just be our side. There are people who are there. So
it sounds like going through organizations who have representation, be that ICCI or others, for engaging in like that international scale is really the move for
yes, and I
involvement.
think we're unique in that we bring people to the negotiations, not just bringing people to COPs. So many universities and other organizations bring people to COPs, but you're still outside of the negotiations. And our goal is that intersection, that space between the negotiations and the science. But for things like Climate Week, many organizations have different things that they do. Opportunities to be involved.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Oh, James, you were about to say something. Go for it.
One thing, which is that if you do have some really policy relevant research results coming out, for example, do let us know, reach out to us, and we'll help to amplify those on our social media. And also, it's really significant work. We can sometimes bring authors into these meetings specifically to present their work too. So just keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, I've just finished preparing for the research dialogues at the Bonn meetings, for example, where we're compiling some of the latest and most impactful, or what we feel most impactful cryosphere science is that we really want to bring to policymakers. And that's the opportunity to sit down with them and present and really have that discussion so that they can really ask questions and have discussion rather than just listen to a presentation or read a paper. And yes, as James said, and I think I mentioned at one point, we do bring people there as well, and authors. And we've done that to other conferences around the world last year. We brought a few people.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all so much again. I saw a huge applause explosion earlier for you all. So just want to extend a formal thank you to ICCI and you all for sharing about how ICCI engages in policy engagement and how folks here can connect with you all. We hope you found the event useful. And one thing we have on the screen here is just we wanted to highlight there are lots of resources on the PSECCO website regarding, in this case, they're early career specific resources. We highlight various organizations, I think including ICCI, and if not, I'll make sure that that's on there within the week for how you can advance professionally and engage in various international spaces, community spaces. We also have lots of educational resources on our website. So highly recommend checking that out. And thanks so much. We will also be attending the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research conference, Open Science Conference later this summer. So look out for PSECCO events related to that. And feel free to connect with our various community spaces, including our Slack space, to connect with other early career researchers regarding professional development opportunities and just learning about what's going on in the polar sphere. Finally, as always, we'd really appreciate you to fill out our post-event survey so we can pass on feedback to ICCI and we can use feedback regarding this event for planning future events. We do read all of those results and they're really helpful for shaping what events we do in the future. So thanks everyone so much for coming and for your patience with the technical difficulties, but I think we got a really wonderful and clear message. And thanks again to ICCI for sharing. Have a really good rest of your day.